In this video, I'll go through all of the published adventures for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, giving an overview about what they're about and how I would rank them in relation to one another. So if you're wondering which adventure you should run for your characters next, or how the adventure you're currently running stacks up to the other adventures in 5th edition, this is the video for you. So without much further ado, let's take a look at the published adventures for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Alright, so first off, for anyone new here, my name is J.A. Valeur and I'm a content creator for Eventyr Games. For a couple of years now, I've been publishing DM's resources and other content for officially published adventures. So what I want to do here is that I'll go through all the published adventures, or at least most of them, and give my subjective opinion about them. So this is how easy are they to play, how fun are they, what kind of content can you expect, and I'll do this in the typical YouTuber fashion by ranking them on a tier list. Alright, so the way this works is that I have all the titles here, and then I have the tier list over here with S being the best and F being the worst. Okay, so starting off, I'll go ahead and bring in the starter set. Now the starter set is this Lost Mines of Phandalin adventure where the characters are looking for a lost mine, and it's meant for beginners, and while there's some of the stuff in there that's actually pretty advanced and also pretty difficult on the player side, I think that the starter set does a really good job of introducing what D&D is. I've played through the starter set numerous times, and I think it's really one of the best adventures in 5th edition, and that could be nostalgia because it was the first adventure I played in 5th edition as well. But I think that the starter set really has something that makes it worthwhile to play. So for me, I put the starter set at the A tier, which considering how early in 5th edition's life cycle it came out, is a pretty good rating. Alright, moving on, we have the Rise of Tiamat, which was published very early in 5th edition's life cycle as well. It's an adventure where the characters have to stop Tiamat from coming to the material plane. It's a two-parter. There's also the Hoard of the Dragon Queen, but I chose to just use one book image here. Now, full disclaimer, I haven't actually played the Rise of Tiamat. It got pretty poor reviews right out the gate, and I had plenty of other adventures to play, and it's not really perhaps most of my alley, at least from what I've read of it. So I can't, of course, give a complete opinion, but I have skimmed through the adventure and I have read a lot of opinions about it. For these reasons, I think that the Rise of Tiamat probably belongs down here around the E or F tier. It's widely considered one of the worst adventures for 5th edition. For these reasons, I think it belongs down here in F. It's really not an adventure I would play without doing a lot of work with it first. Moving on, I think we will go with Out of the Abyss, which I think is the older one of those we have left. Out of the Abyss is a really great concept. I loved the idea when I heard about it. It's the Underdark. It really has a lot of potential, I think, or it had a lot of potential, but it's baffling to me how the adventure is laid out and some of the design choices that have been made. The adventure starts hard on in a scenario. There's no structure guide given. There's no hand-holding for the DM. You basically have to read through the entire book to sort of get an idea about what's going on. Beyond that, there's also a lot of overland travel or underland travel since you're in the Underdark. This just becomes repetitive and quite boring after a while unless the DM really works hard to sort of enhance it or maybe just breeze past it. For this reason, I think Out of the Abyss belongs down here at the E tier, unfortunately. I really loved the idea. I didn't like playing it. Next up, let's go with the Princess of the Apocalypse. This adventure takes place in Somber Hills, I think it's called. It's near where the starter set Lost Mines of Phandalin takes place, and it's also sort of a natural tie-in going from the starter set to the Princess of the Apocalypse. It's more sandboxy, at least in the beginning, and then there's a lot of dungeon crawling, with first crawling through one layer of dungeons and then another. And I'm not a big fan of these huge dungeon crawls. I like dungeons that last for a handful of sessions at most. Once you're in a dungeon, in the same dungeon for 10, 15, 20 sessions, it's, for me personally, I want to do something else at that point. And for these reasons, I think that Princess of the Apocalypse belongs down here at the D tier. It's certainly a playable adventure. It's just not perhaps the most fun adventure for me personally. Alright, next up we have the Tomb of Annihilation. This adventure takes place in Chult, which is a sort of jungle, tropical area in Forgotten Realms, and it has dinosaurs, undead, curses, and liches and stuff. I think the flavor and the theme of this adventure is really great. I was happy to pick it up when I got it. I think there's a lot of cool content in there, locations and so on. And the maps are by Mike Slay, which is by far my favorite map maker for 5th edition. Some of the parts that it doesn't do as well has to do with the whole exploration. You're traveling through the jungle for a long time. And while there are some locations, I think that the survival mechanics of 5th edition aren't really good enough to support an adventure that relies so heavily on traveling through terrain. And that's not a fault of Tomb of Annihilation specifically, it's a fault of 5th edition D&D generally. So for these reasons, I think that the Tomb of Annihilation belongs around here at the C tier. It's certainly better than Prince of Apocalypse and Out of the Abyss, but I don't think it's good enough to approach the top right here. It's sort of the middle of the field adventure for me, but it does have a lot of cool stuff. All right, moving on, we have Storm King's Thunder. This is another big adventure. It takes place in the Sword Coast, and it has the characters battling dragons and giants to restore the ordering, which will make sure that the giants aren't going around rampaging and destroying everything. So it's an adventure of epic proportions, and it takes the characters from level 1 to level 11, I think it is, and through a lot of the Sword Coast. There's really a lot of travel here, but it doesn't relies heavily on survival mechanics as Tomb of Annihilation, because most of the travel it's just ordinary roads, so you don't have to bother so much with survival mechanics. For me personally, I really enjoyed playing Storm King's Thunder. It's still one of my fondest memories of playing 5th edition D&D. I think it's a campaign that has everything that I like in a campaign, which is a lot of traveling around, a lot of social encounters, a lot of cool dungeons, but none of them being too big or too long, as well as this epic feel that you're saving the world, or the Sword Coast in this case. So for me, I think that Storm King's Thunder can get a B rating. So why not higher than B? Well, I think that while it does have some attempt at creating a good structure and showing the DM how to run it, it is still quite difficult. We're not as good yet at laying out the background and synopsis for the adventure. And there's also some of the content in there where the characters have to travel around to various burial grounds that I think is sort of not really polished or finished enough. I ended up skipping it entirely. So I would like to see perhaps a bit more work going into the actual structure of the adventure. But it's a good adventure to run, and there's definitely a lot of things in there that you can grab and use in your other games. All right, I've been leaving Tales from the Yawning Portal down here. It's not a campaign, it's an adventure anthology. Tales from the Yawning Portal takes a lot of older adventures and polishes them up and inserts them into 5th edition, most of them with Mike Slay's maps, which I appreciate. For me, I'm not a huge fan of Tales from the Yawning Portal. We have only run 2 of the adventures in there, I think, and it's simply because some of the adventures aren't really my style or my cup of tea. But it does have a nice little selection of some of the best adventures from over time, and of course the very, very famous Gary Gygax's Killer Dungeon. For me, I think that Tale from Yawning Portal can fall in around the C tier here. It's something I'd pick up if you're looking for a dungeon to place in your adventure, or place in your campaign, or just a dungeon to run for some players, but there's not anything in there that I would go out of my way to run, perhaps besides the epic killer dungeon at the end. Moving on, we have Curse of Strahd, which is perhaps one of the most popular adventures in 5th edition, and it's a bit ironic that I haven't actually run it. I haven't played Curse of Strahd. I haven't run it for one of my groups. It's simply not a concept that I've been overly interested in. I don't like gothic horror as a genre. It's not my cup of tea. So I ended up actually skipping over it, and I haven't come back to run it. Several of the players in my groups have played it and have spoken highly about it. It's supposedly a very good adventure. I also see a lot of people praising it online, and it's, as far as I can tell, one of the most popular adventures still so many years later. So where would I place Curse of Strahd? For me, it would probably fall in around the B tier from what I've read and heard. It's a good adventure, it's great, but for me personally, it's not an S tier or an A tier, simply because that it's not my cup of tea. So if you're into the whole vampire thing, gothic horror, so on, it would probably rank a lot higher for you. Moving on, we come to Ghosts of Saltmarsh, which is another adventure anthology in the styles of Tales from the Yawning Portal. The difference here being that each of the adventures in Ghosts of Saltmarsh has a aquatic theme. So it's all centered around ships and water and whatnot, and these are all ports from earlier editions, so each of the adventures have been published before in the first, second, third, fourth, and so on. We played through Ghost of Saltmarsh as our table, and I have to say that while I was initially very stoked about the theme and the sort of aquatic naval adventures, I'm not a huge fan of the way the adventures have been ported to 5th edition. We have design that goes back 30, maybe even 40 years ago. We've learned a lot about designing adventures since, how to make them fun, how to engage the players more, and I think that just taking an adventure that is 30 years old and porting it directly simply because of nostalgia doesn't always work. So for me, I think that Ghost of Saltmarsh it's probably another C tier adventure for me. All right, moving on, we have Waterdeep Dragon Heist, which is one of the newer adventures. It's come out in the last 2 or 3 years, and it's an urban adventure that takes place in Waterdeep, where the characters have to find a large catch of stolen gold. It's only a 1 to 5th level adventure, so it's rather short. I think the Waterdeep Dragon Heist is perhaps one of the most cohesive and well put together adventures. We get a nice guide for how the adventure plays out in the start. There's put a lot of effort into making it replayable, or at least have alternating villains for some of the later chapters, which does make it semi-replayable, as the first chapters and the last chapter will still be almost identical. I love the urban flavor. I love chapter 2 in particular, where there's a lot of quest hooks you can sort of build upon, expand upon, which is also something we've done and published on the DM's Guild. While it does need some work in places, it's one of the better adventures for 5th edition in my opinion. So I'd probably put it up here at the A tier. Could be an S tier. We're approaching something, but yeah, it's a really good adventure. So of course, naturally, we have Dungeon of the Mad Mage coming in next, which is sort of the continuation of Dragon Heist. For me personally, I wasn't a huge fan of Dungeon of the Mad Mage, and as I've stated previously in the video, I don't enjoy these super long dungeon delves where you're in a dungeon for 15-20 sessions. So of course, for me, I wouldn't rank it higher than maybe a D tier. I have actually zero interest in playing it. I've looked through it, and I've also considered playing maybe one of the levels, taking out and putting in as a dungeon, but I haven't really done it. I've heard good about it from people who like that style of play, but for me personally, I'm not into my adventure being just about going into a dungeon. All right, and now we get to the really exciting part with the newest 3 adventures from 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, and these are of course Descent into Avernus, Icewind Dale, and Candlekeep Mysteries. Starting with Descent into Avernus, this is another concept that I was hugely intrigued about when I first heard it, about going into hell to try and save the city, bring it back to the material plane. There's fiends, demons, and devils, fallen angels. I think the story in there is quite beautiful. I think it's definitely one of the better stories. Structure-wise, the adventure has some issues with being fairly linear throughout, which of course is something you can take steps to prevent or to change, which we've also covered in our DM's resources for Descent into Avernus. But overall, I think that Descent into Avernus is a very thorough and good long campaign. So for these reasons, I think that Descent into Avernus is another A tier adventure. All right, then there's Icewind Dale, the newest wholesale campaign for 5th edition. When I first heard about the theme, I wasn't particularly intrigued. The Arctic setting is cool, pun intended, but probably not something that I thought I would want to spend 20, 40, 50, 100 sessions going through. But I was pleasantly surprised to see that Icewind Dale has a lot of other content as well. There's some dungeons. The latter 1/3 of the game perhaps doesn't even take place in an Arctic environment per se. So I think it has a lot of other concepts in there as well. As some of you who've been following along with our Rime as a Frostmaiden video series probably know, I don't think it has some shortcomings when it comes to the whole structure of the adventure and the story and how they fit together. And I think it's quite clear that there's been a lot of different authors involved that have sort of piled their work together, and there's been someone going in there trying to stitch it together. And that stitching is a bit rough in places where you have a lot of exposition and linear plot lines and so on. Even so, I think that Icewind Dale has so much cool content in there. It is really one of the most inspiring books there's out there. There's so many different ideas because there's so many different people involved, and I really like the overall storyline. If you polish it up and sort of bring it to the forefront what it's really about, or at least what I think it's really about, you end up with something that is a great story and that does make sense and can be told without copious amounts of exposition. So for these reasons, I think we can place Icewind as an S tier. I think it is really the best adventure that's come out for 5th edition so far. Descent into Avernus and Dragon Heist are probably only adventures that for me would rival it. Some would maybe put Curse of Strahd up there as well. Lastly, we have Candlekeep Mysteries. Candlekeep Mysteries is another adventure anthology like Tale from the Yawning Portal and Ghosts of Saltmarsh, and like these, it has a lot of different adventures bound together by a single theme, which in this case is books and Candlekeep. So each adventure revolves around a book that the characters can find at Candlekeep. I don't know how many parties are actually going to go to Candlekeep and stumble upon a book at the exact right level and so on. So it sort of leaves it up to DM to tie these books into the campaign they're running or the adventure they're running. But if you take that aside and simply come to terms with the fact that you have to set this adventure up some way, the adventures inside are really great one-shots in almost all of the cases. I think that the writers have done a very good job at making something that can be plugged in nearly anywhere, that has a self-contained plot, and which can make for a session or two of really enjoyable gameplay. Now, there's some dots in there or some adventures that I'm not particularly interested in running, but by far the most of them are actually really fun concepts that I could see myself running as a one-shot and that we have run as one-shots in our groups. In any case, I think Candlekeep Mysteries is a great addition to 5th edition's adventures. It's certainly something that you will get a lot of use out of buying, even if you don't end up running all of the adventures. Just a handful of them and you'll have gotten your money's worth, definitely. So yeah, this rating is probably how I see the adventures of 5th edition. You could, of course, shuffle it around a bit. What is S tier? What is A tier? How good are each adventure really? Am I being too harsh with Rise of Tiamat? If you have any comments or maybe disagree with some of the ranking here or have some questions about why I would place this one here or that one there, please let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to have a discussion about it, and perhaps there's something that I'm missing or there's something you can tell me about one of these adventures that can change my mind. And then this is just to sort of show you what you may want to run next time, give you some ideas about what could be fun for you, and sort of give an overview of what we have going on in 5th edition. Alright, so that was my ranking of the adventures from 5th edition. If you enjoyed it, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'll try to put out more content like this, especially if you let me know if it's something you would like to see. And if you want to influence what we make videos about or write about or what content we produce, you can support us on patreon.com/eventyr, where you'll also get free content each week, and each month we also have an adventure for our hero tier supporters. You can also sign up to the mailing list and follow us on Twitter, all that stuff. There's links to that in the description below. Alright, so that's it for me. Thank you for watching along, and I hope to see you in the next one.